Hello everyone, my name is Kristina Devochko and I am one of the board members of Norwegian.net user group in Oslo, and I would like to welcome you to the April's meetup of NNUG Oslo. About Norwegian.net user group, we are part of the .NET Foundation and we are an independent user group with focus on .NET. We were created by developers for developers, and our speakers are developers themselves and have been working with .NET and with technology for a while. You can reach us on the social media. We have recently created an Instagram account as well, which you can see in the bottom on the slide. If we are always looking for new speakers, so if you know of anyone who would like to talk at NNUG Oslo, or you would like to be the speaker yourself, please reach out to us either on email or on any of the social media accounts presented here on the slide. I would also like to take the opportunity and thank our sponsors. Thanks to them, it is possible for us at NNUG Oslo to run these meetups on frequent basis. This is the current board of Norwegian.net user group Oslo. If you have any questions, feedbacks, or comments, please reach out to any one of us. We are happy to have a chat with you. I would also like to take the opportunity to mention that NNUG Oslo are the organizers of Global Azure Norway happening from May 5th to May 7th. Global Azure Norway is part of the global initiative called Global Azure, where we will have 2 days with virtual sessions from the speakers you can see on the slide. And on the 7th of May, we will have a practical hands-on day at Microsoft Norway offices, where we will have 3 parallel tracks. One will be about Azure API management with Sven Malvik. The second track will be preparation to AZ900, which is Azure Fundamentals Microsoft certification with Håkon Silvernagel. And we will have the third track, which will be a hands-on practical workshop based on Microsoft Learn collection, where NNUG team will be present to help you out. You can find more information and register for the Global Azure Norway by scanning the QR code you can see on the right-hand side, or going directly to the link you can see below. Also, we are running the meetup in cooperation with Microsoft. So there is an opportunity to win a Microsoft Azure backpack, which is also only available to those who are attending the meetup physically. But you are also very much welcome to add Microsoft Azure as your skill to the LinkedIn account. And by scanning the QR code you can see on the top, you can learn more about creating an open source program by using GitHub and the best practices. So the agenda for today is like this. From 5:30 until 6, we are having pizza and mingling and greetings to all the participants. From 6 to 6:05, there will be a welcome and introduction, which is right now. And after that, Thomas Qvidahl, our today's speaker, will take over and talk about how open source software evolved and completely changed software development. And lastly, we will have a few minutes for Q&A and discussions. All right, with no further ado, I would like to give the floor further to our today's speaker, Thomas Qvidahl, who will be talking about how open source software evolved and completely changed modern software development. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Qvidahl. I will be your presenter tonight. No, my journey has been since I started working in IT. I started back in 1995. Grasp that for the young guys. I had an early intro to Linux, and I've always been aware that there was this thing called open source. I made my first web page in 1998 with the Microsoft front page. I'm not too proud of that fact though, but we got a few hundred visitors. It was nice. It was a new thing. And I made my first weblog in 2002. It was a travel diary that I used when I was going interrailing down Europe, and I made this thing with Linux, with Apache, with MySQL, and with PHP. So it's what's known as the LAMP stack, if you have heard of that. These are all open source products. I just used them and they worked great. I didn't think about it at the time, but well, there they were. But as we will see throughout this presentation, that open source, it started about the same time, and those were the early days. And I kind of followed the development of this over the years, but I've only recently become aware of how prevalent it is, how it's everywhere, how it's really in everything we do. There is open source for some way. And let's see now if I should probably connect my computer to the internet so we can. Oh, we failed to connect. Okay, you want to try again? Yes, please try again. And let's see if that will work. Yes, we are now connected to the internet. I have made, oh, this is hard. I have made a Menti. If you guys wanna do me the honor of going into the Menti page and punching in the code, there are just there's a Q&A in there. So if you're a bit shy and just want to ask your questions in there, you can do that. There's also on the next page here. There's a line where you can enter the names of your favorite open source projects. And if you want them to be really big, you can enter them more times, I think. Should be possible. But if I want to make this, it's going to be like a word cloud. And I'll take that with me later and I'll publish it somehow. We'll look back at this during the presentation as well, once or twice. So you can just keep posting comments, questions, and open source projects in there. But the presentation will run on the tab to the left, so we will not see that for a while. Okay, there's the first one. Yay! It will get smaller as there are added new ones. Let's see. Okay, back to the presentation. So the agenda for the presentation is, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. There's some history, what came before open source, how did this thing evolve, how did it start? And then there's the growth and how that started working, and also we'll take a special look at how Microsoft have evolved their stance towards open source. And you see that also I use capitalization some places and not other places, but don't pay no mind to that. It's open source is open source is open source, so that's okay. So how it's evolved into to be a major part of really any business. And I want, most of you guys are probably working, and girls are working for companies, I guess. So I want to give you some of these questions that we are asking in this presentation. I want you to take them to your manager and ask them there and see if they're aware of this thing. So we'll touch briefly by licenses. It's not my favorite subject, but it's very important in open source. We'll do a little bit of deep dive into what it means for a business to be involved in open source, how you can contribute, what communities are, how they work, and also there's a little thing called inner source, which is it's a good option for some cases. So let's not delve any further. Well, let's look at this. I'm thinking that this should take about, you see, down here it says like it's 66 slides. Don't be scared. It's every time I hit the next one, it's like every line there's going to be an increment there. So it's not really 66 slides. But I think I have like a halfway mark in the presentation, and that should be about, did we say 45 minutes for the presentation? So we'll see. It could be an hour. I hope you bear with me, but we'll see. It could be 2 hours. I don't know. So let's see here. Before open source, this is like the 1950s, 1948 actually. This is the first software program. This is a software program. It's 17 instructions, and it runs on a computer for the first time in history. That's a monumental time. That's something very special. These two guys, no, three guys actually, Frederick Williams, Tom Kilburn, and Geoff Tootill, they developed something they call the small-scale experimental machine. I tried to figure out what the program does. I have no idea. It says like Kilburn highest factor routine on the top there. So I guess that's what it does. Well, actually, the first program that was ever written for a computer was done 100 years before by Ada Lovelace in 1842. It was a program that would calculate something called Bernoulli numbers, and you guys with the master's degrees, you know what that is. I don't know. I have no idea. So, but it took actually 100 years before a machine was able to actually run a program routine, program software. So that's a bit of scale there. So back in the days, well, this is like a paper tape. This is how you programmed computers back in the day. And hardware was a real value because it was like the IBM guy said, there would be a need for 5 computers in the world. Well, there were probably about 5 computers at the time, so hardware was the real value, and software was just stuff that you needed to run the hardware or use the hardware. So sharing source code or sharing programs, that was the default. That's what you do because, yeah, well, you have to. One little thing that I forgot to mention, the sponsors you mentioned, there's also another sponsor, of course, in the top left corner. It's my employer. They sponsor my trip down here and graciously allows me to spend my working hours doing this. So I'm very thankful for that. And there we'll leave it at that. Let's see. So this is like paper tape. I don't know if any one of you have programmed with paper tape. I don't think so. I definitely have not. And I'm glad that we can look back at that and just think that, oh, we're so happy we don't have to do that. Because if you think programming in Notepad would be bad, this would be 10 times or 100 times worse. So we'll make a quick jump to 1975. I think that was the time when Bill Gates and Paul Allen, these nice two fellows on the photo on the right, they did not discover Microsoft. They founded Microsoft. At this time, computers are being they're more general, and so software suddenly becomes something that you can actually like multiply and use for a lot of computers because all the computers work the same way. They're more general, and so Bill Gates, Paul Allen, and some other guy whose name I forget at this moment, they made a basic like programming language for the Altair 8800, and he was selling this for like proprietary software. They were selling it as licensed software, and of course the thing with proprietary and licensed software like this is that the authors, they own the software, but they don't only own that, they make it so that the software is compiled, right? So you can't change the code, you can't open it up and look at how it's working. You can't run it on any other hardware architecture. So there's a lot of restrictions there. Of course, it's a business model. It's how you make money it's a way to make money of making software. And that was exactly what these guys were doing. So there was also some things called shareware, public domain, and freeware and stuff like that. That is not open source. We will get into the definition of open source and look at what that is. But those things were similar. They were giving it away for free, but it was not the same thing. So open source software, it became about when Microsoft and Netscape Navigator, they were battling it out on who were going to be the #1 browser. And so in 1998, Netscape, viewed by many as a desperate move, they were trying to win over Microsoft basically, and they were a bit desperate maybe, but they decided we'll open source, we'll open the source code for this software, and everyone could contribute to it and start working on it. So it was a desperate move, but it was actually a start of something really great. So they were battling it out, and I have a link there to a news article from '98. I don't think we'll look at it. It's kind of funny, but the presentation will be available later, so you'll see that there. this was the beginning of the Mozilla project. Actually, the foundation came later, but this was at the start of this. So the Firefox browser, it came out in 2004 in version 1, and that has been my go-to browser almost as long, I think. I'm still using it. I'm of course running it on Firefox here, version, I don't know, 90 something, whatever. So we had Internet Explorer for a very, very long time, too long. I learned recently that even Microsoft employees themselves had to use Internet Explorer right up until 2020 to write their expense reports on it. So that's kind of sad, but that's how it is. And also Google Chrome has come along and stolen much of the market. And well, while it's open source, it's not really open source, and it's Google in the back there, and they're doing their thing. So might be not the best choice for privacy, but well, Google, Chrome works well. It's a great browser. Anyway, of the big ones, then the Mozilla Firefox is the only one that remains completely open. So is there anyone here that's not familiar with the term source code? You know what I mean by source code, right? Like the code that we write and then we compile it into something that the computer understands and stuff. Yeah, that's good. So that's mostly an irreversible process, and machine code is of course not readable by people, and it's very hard to reverse it and try to understand how it works. Anyway, just touching by that. So this young lady, her name is Christine Peterson. She termed the name open source. She was the first one to start using it. It was in a strategy session they had back in the day after the Netscape announcement. And this session came about as a realization that this is something huge. This is something real, and we have an opportunity here to educate and to advocate for the superiority of open development processes. So her and a lot of other people were gathered, had a session, decided that we will make a foundation based on this. So later in February, the Open Source Initiative was founded, and their website is still very much alive. So the OSI, as they're called, it's like Mozilla Foundation. It's a non-profit, and they're working to keep the hour in a source. What's their catch line? And they made the open source definition, which is what we use today to call things open source or not. So they also ratify new types of OSS licenses, so open source licenses, and they do a lot of work in the open source space. So the term open source, we distinguish it from well, it's more politically and philosophically focused, the Free Software Foundation. They're started by Richard Stallman and some other guys back in the 80s. But the open source and the free software, they're similar but not the same. And quite frankly, I think that open source is more pragmatic. It's more practical to use. The Free Software Foundation is like, we want to end all patents and all the bits should be free. And it's like, well, you can want that, but maybe it's not so practical. Anyway, sometimes, just to be sure, we call it free and libre open source software like FLAS to cover all the bases. And well, I guess that's just more of the same. Smør på flask, as we say in Norway. So anyway, Libre, the name comes from being free, not as in bear, but free as in freedom. The software wants to be free. Well, I thought we would take a little time and look at the open source definition. And this is going to, this is going to mess up my presentation, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to do like this, and it pops up there, but it also pops up here, but that's okay. I'll go up and look at the open source definition. So this is the opensource.org webpage that I mentioned earlier. And the open source definition is just 10 points. Well, it says that the software should be freely redistributable. So you can't charge something to distribute the software. Well, kind of basic. The source code must be included. So source code is of course the software in non-compiled form. So you can also of course distribute it as compiled software, but it's not so useful. And where a product is not distributed with source code, there must be a well-publicized means of obtaining the source code. So it's like way before, when we really didn't have internet access, everyone, then it would be feasible to like distribute software on a CD or a diskette or whatever. So anyway, so one of the key points here is that derived works, the license must allow modifications and derived works so that the software can be changed and added to and distributed under the same terms as the license of the original software. And contrary to popular belief, the integrity of the author's source code is important. If you make it so that the software is not allowed to be modified by other people, then you must make it so that patch files can change the software at runtime. That's another way to do it. I don't think anyone does it. I don't know. Maybe someone does. I don't know. But the most prevalent way of doing it is by doing releasing the source code. So, point number 5 is one of some controversy. It's very short, but it holds a lot of thoughts. You cannot discriminate against any person or group of persons. Usually a good thing. That's you couldn't deny Adolf Hitler to use your software, for instance.
Or Russians to take more.
Or maybe Russians.
Current example.
Maybe even Russians. You cannot also discriminate against fields of endeavor. So if you want to add some more to it, then if the Russians want to make rockets with your software in it, you can't deny it. And that's because this is meant to be truly open, right? So if you don't like genetic research, you can't open source something. Of course, you can use your software for anything and do whatever you want with it, but you can't call it open source because the world has agreed that this is the definition of open source. The distribution of the license says something about how it should, the license should follow the software so that you can, so you're sure which license that's required. The license must not be specific to a product, the license must not restrict other software, and it must be technology neutral. I don't think we're going to go so much into all of those points, but here it is. It's based on the so it says on the bottom, it's based on the Debian free software guidelines. So Debian were making Linux before this. So we'll look at Linux's start as well. So, well, there it is. It's not too much to grasp. It's a pretty basic thing, but it's also meant to cover a lot of bases. So I will try to hit, there we go. And I'll try to, to come back here. And where is there's my cursor. And if I can just move back, yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you. Yep, as I said, it's based from the free software guidelines. And if I hit, there we go, we get to the next line. So, open source software started growing. So Linux was started when Mr. Torvalds in 91, he wrote a message, said, "Hello everybody using Linux." I can't do the Finnish accent, I'm sorry. "I'm doing a free operating system. It's just a hobby. It won't be big and professional like GNU." So GNU is, everyone knows what GNU is. It's the Free Software Foundation started the GNU project because they wanted, GNU means, GNU is not Linux. No, it means GNU is not Unix. Yeah, so it's a retronym, that's what you call it. But they wanted to make an open version of Unix, basically. It was started way back in 1983 by Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation. So Mr. Torvalds, he was making an operating system, free version of what he was using, that's called Minix at the time. And there was a lot of Unix software and utilities and programs that were contributed by developers. And most of the components were already ready, but there was like, there was a kernel was missing. So Linux, I guess there were other alternatives, but Linux became the go-to version or the go-to distribution or the go-to kernel that people kind of gathered around. So fast forward 30 years to 2021. Linux is running on absolutely everything, from tiniest IoT devices like the Pi Zero. It costs 10 euros to buy a Pi Zero, to all the 500 top supercomputers in the world. Like $1 million computers, they're all running Linux. So I guess we could say that Linux has become, well, like a standard of sorts. And even Microsoft is a huge proponent of open source. We'll look at that later. A huge contributor to Linux kernel and drivers and everything around there. And Linux just basically runs on any hardware, because if you can compile it, it will work, right? So you can take your whatever little IoT device computer and whatever kind of CPU is in there, if you can make a Linux compile on it, it will work. Also, there are like 2 billion Android phones in the world. I have one in my jacket. They all run Android OS, which is also based on Linux. So, there we have it. That's not bad for a little hobby project that won't be big and professional like GNU. I think he made his point there. Was there another point? There's nothing new on the screen now. There's a slide here that's not showing. I think I know where it is. It's fallen below because I added the photo, the picture, and the line has dropped below there. But it says it can even run on your laptop. And that's true. I've had Linux laptops. This is a Mac, of course, which is based on another distribution of something that's not Linux, but FreeBSD. It works great. It's a good experience. It takes some getting used to for a Windows user. I know because I used to be one. And I said I used to be one because I've been using Microsoft products for most of my career and been a huge Microsoft fan. I have spent considerable time on Windows, on Linux, and on Mac. And I can say that I love and hate them as much as they love and hate me back. So I guess you can say it's a love-hate relationship. Some things are great on Mac, and some things are great on Windows, and some things are great on Linux, and some things suck on all three, and I don't know. It's not really a big concern for me. I use any kind of operating system, and they have their pluses and minuses. So, another thing that came out of this time was Git. And everyone who's working with the development, or even with the infrastructure as code, for instance, probably know what Git is. It's a version control system. And it's not an abbreviation, as many people think. It's the literal word Git, like an unpleasant person. That's the meaning of it. So I don't know. I think it's a bit of self irony from Mr. Linus Torvalds, who was also the creator of Git. He started this project because he needed some better way to collaborate on making Linux. And they were developing it distributed, of course. So this thing came about in 2005. It's not perfect. It works. There are some quirks. There's a lot of strange stuff going on in there, but it works very well. And I used to say that before we had lots of different version control systems, and now we have Git. But there are, of course, many others like SVN, there's Mercurial. There was something way back that's called Visual Source Safe from Microsoft. Has anyone worked on that? There's one recognition here. Yeah, I think anyone who has worked with that has some memories from it. Is that correct?
It did. The smallest time it took into consideration was seconds.
Oh.
So if you happen to check in at the same second that another programmer, which could fairly well happen, the file just went corrupt and disappeared from your computer as well as from the source code. Interesting.
Yes. If I have two files that are created within the same second, I wouldn't need any of them because they would null each other out. I don't know. That's interesting.
We all learned to take it back up before we checked in code.
Yeah. Yes, that's nice. We don't have to do that with Git. We'll get a merge conflict, and that can be a pain to fix anyway. But it's better, at least. Well, we needed that. We needed to have that. We need to have version control to make software, and Git has become like the de facto standard that's used everywhere. So it's another open source project, of course. That's why I mention it. So at this time, let's look at Mr. Microsoft and their beautiful logos over time. What has Microsoft been doing in all this time? And I'm thinking back to basically back to 1975 when they started, when Windows came about, when open source was founded and started being a thing. How did Microsoft react? Because it's, of course, we have to mention that. Yeah, I know, you know what I'm thinking about, yeah. Well, this is the .NET user group, right? So we have to look really hard at what Microsoft have been doing. So even if, as a proprietary software company, they're making their money of selling licenses, but they've still been working with open source for many, many years. And they're, as I mentioned previously, during our pizza conversation, they are among the biggest contributors, creators, and supporters of open source software around the world. So, while we admire these beautiful logos, we can step ahead, if that's okay. Back to the little cute picture of Bill Gates and Mr. Allen. In 1975, things happened back then that were sometime in the 70s, IBM was forced to unbundle their hardware and software because there was an antitrust suits that came their way. So this opened for more software vendors, like software was being developed by independent companies. I hope you're okay in there. So computers were becoming more mainstream, as I mentioned. They were selling like thousands or millions of a computer can run the same type of software. So then suddenly software becomes the thing that you need to have great software for all kinds of uses. But back in the day, if this is not picking up on the microphone, there's a bottle, there's an avalanche of bottles in the background. Okay. So Microsoft was one of these vendors were making software and they're trying to sell it, but well, people were pirating software back then, and there's copying software, and they're sending their praise to Microsoft, like, yeah, we love your basic. Yeah, did you pay for it? No, we didn't, but we love it. Yeah, so okay. So Gates was not happy about that, so he wrote the open letter to hobbyists. Okay, let's see if I can open that. It's a, oh, there we go. Okay, so it's a Wikipedia article, but I'm going to flip down here. You can read all about it, but there is the letter. So, okay, one more click. There we go. So what they've been doing, they've been spending months and months and months working on BASIC, trying to make this thing work, and it's obviously really good software because everyone loves it. But the feedback we have gotten from the hundreds of people who say they're using BASIC has all been positive. Two surprising things are apparent, however. Most of these users never bought BASIC. Less of 10% of the Altair owners have bought BASIC, and 2, the amount of royalties we have received from sales to hobbyists makes the time spent on Altair BASIC worth less than $2 an hour. That's not a great deal, even in 1975. So I can understand why we're not, okay, we're trying to sell this thing and people are stealing it. Doesn't feel really fair. So, of course, there's been a lot of controversy around this letter and why Mr. Gates was so angry with people. But I can understand how it works when you're trying to sell things and people are stealing them, whatever it is, if it's cars, whatever it is, it doesn't really work and it's no fun. And I guess back then you couldn't just go to the police and say, hey, someone stole my BASIC, and they would go like, what? They stole your what? Yeah, I don't know. So jump forward a little bit, 1990, Mr. Bill Gates and Mr. Steve Ballmer are running Microsoft, and they're looking at open source and thinking, hey, there's a threat to our business model. This doesn't work. People are making software for free. Why are they doing that? Then there was a leak of documents. They was called the Halloween documents. For what reason, I don't know. But it revealed some internal memos. They had strategies for killing open source projects and wiping them out, and what was it called? Extinguish and embrace, no, embrace and extinguish, something like that, like a strategy for doing that. Microsoft has since said that, okay, this was a single individual's opinions and not the company's opinions. Anyway, there was a company called Lindos Inc. and they made a version of Linux that was called Lindos, and it would run Windows software. They sued Lindos, not for running Windows software, but for the name. At which point the court rejected the claim. Microsoft had to settle this claim, this suit with Lindos, and they had to purchase the Lindos trademark, and they paid $20 million for it at the time. At which point Lindos changed their name to Linspire and continued their business. That's not so nice either, I guess, but that's how it goes. Moving forward a little bit, I just picked out some points here and there for how we are moving forward. Steve Ballmer took over, as you know, as the CEO of Microsoft, and he has been famously quoted as calling Linux a kind of cancer to intellectual property. He said that Linux developers are communists. I can't do anything but laugh at this. This is so very, very, very American. It's like, communists? Really? The only worst thing would be blasphemous, I guess. I don't know. So yeah, I just have to laugh at this a little bit. So it's okay. That's what you were thinking about, right? Yeah. Anyway, things were changing, and even with Steve Ballmer running things, they started experimenting with the shared source. The shared source common language infrastructure is the core of the .NET framework, and that was opened in 2002. In 2004, they made their first open source project, which was the Windows installer XML. All this is in Wikipedia, so it's not really, it's just me quoting things. I picked out some of the interesting facts. So the kind of old school business model, or the old school way of thinking, was slowly losing ground, plus Microsoft was skyrocketing in terms of revenue, so maybe it wasn't such a big deal. You were still selling Windows and Office and whatever, and doing well. So they were actually, they were present at the Linux Tag, which is a German, I think, a conference. Was or is a German conference for Linux enthusiasts. So that was the first time they were there in 2004. They became a huge sponsor of it later. Also in the 2000s, the F# license is released under Apache 2.0. Microsoft launched Codeplex, which was a competitor to GitHub. They later bought GitHub, of course, as you know. Then they partnered with Novell. Does anyone remember Novell NetWare? Yeah, cool. Ooh, that's nice, certified. Yeah, I actually been working a little bit on the Linux, on Novell NetWare as well. Novell NDS before Active Directory. Anyway, they partnered up with them to make sure that SUSE Linux plays well with Windows. So this was actually after Novell had finished NetWare. It was not working for them anymore, so they had they bought SUSE, I think. And Microsoft started contributing to the Linux kernel in 2009. And in other news, hell freezes over and pigs fly. So that's interesting. But things move even further when Mr. Satya Nadella takes over. And well, I'm listing this as the 2010s. He didn't take over until 2014. I think he was in the company for many years before that, but he became the CEO in 2014. So Microsoft became the fifth largest contributor already in 2011 to the Linux kernel. They opened up ASP.NET and all the, maybe not all, but many of the technologies related in 2012. Git support for Tietoevry Foundation Server, I guess it was a big deal. It was a proprietary version control system up until then. 2014, .NET Framework is opened up. The whole of the .NET Framework, the cross-platform parts of it, like, I guess, .NET Framework 5, is that the first one that was cross-platform? I think. .NET Core, yeah, .NET Core, that's one that I'm thinking about. Yes, thank you. So yeah, and also in 2015 they co-founded the Node.js Foundation, which is a huge part of the internet today with the NPM package management and stuff like that. We'll look a little bit at that afterwards. Visual Studio Code, which I of course made this presentation in, is at least partial open source. You have the Codium project, which is truly open source. Remove some more of the Microsoft things there. There's some telemetry stuff that some of the purists don't like, that Microsoft are spying on me when I'm writing code. Yeah, so there's the pure open source version of that. In 2017, they joined the open source initiative, like I mentioned before, the OSI. What's it called? The Cloud Native Compute Foundation, which makes, for instance, Kubernetes and stuff like that from Google. It's part of the Linux Foundation. And they also joined the MariaDB Foundation, which was a fork of MySQL, which is one of the big open source databases today. And then there is 2018, when Microsoft acquired GitHub for some sum of money I can't remember, which was probably astronomical. But there was a little surge after that where people were leaving. Oh, we're not going to be Microsoft, under the heel of Microsoft. We're going to go over to GitLab or whatever. And it was just a little while because I think they acquired like 10 million new users next year. So, well, that's it's not such a bad thing. But I think that Microsoft, since Steve Ballmer's famous quotes of calling things cancer and stuff, there was some bad blood between them and the open source community, understandably, and it took a long time for that to be forgiven, I guess. So, well, that was a short roundup. I'm going to stop at 2018. You know that things have been moving forward since then. Microsoft is one of the biggest contributors to open source in the world today, so that's it's all good. It's perfect for me. Licenses in open source. The important thing is that all these open source, all the licenses that are called open source, they adhere to the open source definition as explained earlier. I won't go so much into depth with this. You can go and look at all the OSI licenses that are the licenses that are actually been ratified by the OSI, and they are allowed to be called open source, I guess, because you have a lot of other different licenses that don't really mix well with the open source definition, and so you can call them whatever you want, but you cannot call them open source. So there's a nice page that's called tldrlegal.com. It's for those who don't want to read long lists of text. You can just search for a name for a license, and you just get like bullet points of this is what you're allowed to do, this is what you can't do, and so forth. So it's very easy to get a grasp on what the license actually means. So quickly, I want to share an example of dependencies, how very reliant we have become on open source components, frameworks, libraries. So I did a small test for myself. I could repeat it here, but it's going to take a long time because my computer is running very hot, and it's the poor thing is full of crud. But the point I'm trying to make here is when you create software, you try to do things yourself, but you discover that, oh, I need this function and it's available in this library, and I can just pull down this library and use it, and it works great. And so typically that's what you do. You don't write everything from scratch. So NPM, like I said, Node Package Manager, is one of the largest code repositories for JavaScript and other code frameworks and libraries. And Gatsby.js is it's a framework for making a content management system, like a web server that gets data from everywhere, like some articles here and some stuff there. And Gatsby is a really nice place to work to make like advanced content management systems. So I did this little thing where I just pulled down the Gatsby CLI. I initiate a single Gatsby site, and I don't put in anything extra. It just runs the initialization of Gatsby and just pulls down the dependencies you need, and so you're ready to start writing your code. But before you've written a single line of code yourself, there's a lot of stuff that's going on. So I got this little tool. It's called Clock. Counts lines of code and get it. Yeah. So I just counted everything that was in there, and then I ran Clock, which would list up all the lines of code that it found. And I guess that's kind of hard to read, but it says at the top there it's JavaScript. It's 1.8 million lines of code. Then we have JSON and Markdown. We don't call that code, do we? But it's TypeScript on place number 4. That's 211,000 lines. And there's like 42,000 text lines, and there are 13,000 files that have been ignored by this software and stuff like that. So it counts down to 2.7 million lines of code in total. And this is software that's been lovingly crafted for you by the open source communities. It's been made freely available for download, for use, to modify, and you can profit from it, no problem. And there is no discrimination, remember? So everyone can do this. So imagine if you had to write all this functionality yourself. You will never get off ground with your software project. But anyway, that's how it is today. There's a lot of open source software that's like, it's underneath everything and you don't really know where it is, but it's there. So I just want to take time and acknowledge that. I also want to take time and acknowledge our Menti cloud. Let's see if there is the cursor, and if I can move it up here. And let's see now if we, yes, look at this nice little cloud here. There's room for more though. There are many nice little things. Linux is probably the big one, yeah. So many people know about the Linux and Ansible and KeePass. I used to run KeePass. Now I run Bitwarden. It's a really nice way to keep my passwords safe. Ansible I've used a lot. .NET Core used a little bit. I use Terraform a lot and VS Code a lot. And there are so many others as well. It's like when I did the Gatsby example and I ran npm ls, where you can like list all the dependencies, it counts out to 2,855 dependencies just to start working with Gatsby. It's insane. You run the tree command, it will run for minutes, literally. So again, there's so much software going on in open source, and it's so much that's going on. Yeah, just please keep posting things here if you like. See if there's any questions. No questions for the audience, from the audience right now, but that's okay. Do that later. Oh, how nice. It's an animation. Anyway, this was just a small example. The thing is that when you make a software project, most of it is probably open source, and we just write a little stuff on top there just to make things work like we want them to. So anyway, are there any questions at this moment? Does anyone want to ask something? No? That's okay then. We'll move along. We'll look into business and being a company that relies on making open source, being a company that uses open source, relies on having open source available to do their business. And there was this guy, a colleague of mine, a few weeks ago. I was talking about the same thing, and he was going like, yeah, but I remember I was on this project once where we were only allowed to use Java and the internal libraries of Java, nothing else outside. And I was like, yeah, and Java is that open source? Yes, it's open source. But it's run by, yes, it's owned by Oracle. They bought Sun, and then they got MySQL and Java. And we have the greatest fan of Java sitting on the, it's okay. There's an example. This is just no particular order. It's just a rambling of things. Like Facebook, they have made React. So many websites are being made by using React now. Google had their internal thing they called Borg, which turned into Kubernetes and was given to the Linux Foundation and is now run under the Cloud Native Compute Foundation as an open source product. We talked about HashiCorp also during our pizza break. Terraform, Console, Packer, Vagrant, and you mentioned Nomad. It's also a great product from them. They make everything open source, I think. Maybe not everything, but a lot of things. Red Hat was bought by IBM quite a few years ago at $34 billion. That's a billion with a B. That's a huge amount of money. So I guess there is money to be made, even if it's open source. Canonical is the company behind Ubuntu. SUSE, as previously mentioned, they have the Linux Enterprise Server. And there's Docker with the Docker engine. The Docker engine is still open source and freely available, by the way, even if Docker Desktop now is licensed for business. So these are just, these are just the companies that are making their business on open source. And well, it looks like it's quite feasible. These are quite big companies. Maybe I missed someone. That's not really relevant, but that's okay. And then there are some of the other companies, like the one that I represent, Tietoevry, consulting businesses who make software for other users. Well, I think it's time to get a little serious. This could come off as a bit harsh if you're a bit on the light side, but today it's basically a fact that every business is a software business. Doesn't matter if you're making nuclear plants or you're making growing ordinary plants in your garden. If you're going to do business, then you're going to use software. So software is eating business, has been said, and also open source is eating software. Every business then is an open source business because, well, there is software everywhere. And every software project relies on open source components. That's maybe a harsh statement or a bold statement, but it turns out when they go through and analyze software projects that most of the software projects they find are consisting of 80 to 90% open source software, and the rest is just what you make in the software. So like you already have a head start of 2.7 million lines of code in the Gatsby example, and you have to write then at least 270,000 lines of code to even get to 10%. That's 1%? No, that's 10%. So anyway, it's a huge part of any project. And then most open source components or projects, they rely on communities. The communities are the people behind the open source software. That can be huge companies like Facebook or Google, but it is most likely just a bunch of friends or people with the same or similar challenges or needs for software that get together and make things. And every community relies on contribution. So if no one contributes to an open source project, it will just stop and die and won't work. And of course, if it's not needed by anyone, then it will stop by itself. But a big part of this problem here is that while the contributions are like the lifeblood of open source, companies like mine are making their billions as a direct consequence of all this software being available. And we're literally able to stand on the shoulders of 1,000 little giants, right? Like 2,855 little giants in the Gatsby example. So it's the same basically for all the companies across the globe. We're all using open source, and we are all very much relying on open source. The difference, I think, is who is contributing back, who are doing their thing or doing the part and taking time out from their employees' time and investing in open source and giving something back. That's the differentiating factor. And everyone can contribute back, either through direct, like putting developers on to fixing a bug or something, or by just financing the foundations that work with open source. And I'm happy to announce that Tietoevry is now a member of the Linux Foundation, so we indirectly sponsor, I think there are 200 plus projects in the Linux Foundation that we indirectly sponsor by being members there. And we're doing some more stuff as well. I'll get back to that later. So, who are these people? Who makes open source? Like, and why would they do it? Like for free? I guess part of it is hobby work or enthusiastic work, but people don't like working for free, really. So we'll take a little minute here and just talk about how it's made. So people who share a need, they get together and they collaborate on something and they start creating something that becomes a piece of software that's, oh, this is working great, so let's share it with the world. And they realize that when they realize that it can be of use to others, they can open it up and they can take contributions from other people, and it starts growing and takes a life of its own. And when people create together, they learn from each other as well, and they collaborate on creating this thing. But the problem is that sometimes it gets really popular, like millions of downloads every week. And if that was, if that came with a lot of new contributions and a lot of new happy developers who would like to contribute back to the software, that's great software, this is working great, we need to fix this, we need to do that. But instead, many times they just get like angry issues, like stating, hey, this shit doesn't work, why doesn't it work, it's been months, and it's like, okay, maybe help us out here. So that's the sad fact that there are some of the smaller open source projects, the maintainers are really getting burned out, and they just, okay, we'll just leave this because it's not fun anymore. It's like, we started because it was fun, it's not fun anymore, so we're not earning anything, so let's not do it anymore. So that's part of the thing with that. So, but when we are like developers, we are all kinds of people in IT, we could get in and do things. And there are different roles in an OSS community, like maintainers, possibly those who have full access to the open source repository, and they manage like the direction for this thing, and they decide what gets in and what's out. Then there are committers. They are like close to the project, and they're considered reliable and responsible enough to be able to commit directly, rather than going through a maintainer. Contributors, they can, like most projects, if you go to GitHub, then you can be a contributor, you can fork the project, you can make changes and make a pull request to have it included. Then there are users. They don't contribute any code, but they use the software, and they can file bug reports, they can file issues, and like try to be helpful and test new versions and do stuff like that. They can do documentation and other things. And then there are others, be like event managers, or people who are trying to make this community work and try to work out how things should work, not even in the code, but just how we can get people to work on this thing together. And the Linux Foundation, they have an article called Participating in OSS Communities. That's a great read. They also have a course. It's a beginner's guide for open source software development. It's highly recommended. Many of the points that I bring up here are in that course. And then there's a book that I read recently. It's called Forge Your Future with Open Source, which basically everything that's in that book is already on the internet, but I thought it was nice to support the authors of the book, because they are working hard on open source. So I bought the book, I read it, it's quite nice. I gave it away though, so I don't have any more. It's in Bergen now. I was hoping it would travel further, but it's stuck there. So, contribution to open source, what can you do? If you're not a developer, what can you do? Well, if you're a community manager, you can coordinate the efforts and help shape the product to try to see where it goes. As a technical writer, you can improve documentation, and you can improve the quality of the written text around everything. As a regular user, as I mentioned, you can test the software, you can provide feedback. As a developer, of course, you can write code, you can improve features, fix bugs and improve features. If you're a native language speaker like me, I speak Norwegian, you can translate the software, or you can add documentation. You can, as a creative artist, you can, well, if the software needs it, you can create original graphics, icons, templates, design systems, sound effects, and music, and whatever it needs, right? So there are so many things. And then there is an article, again, it's called How to Contribute. And I believe that this article is this one? Yeah, it has a GitHub favicon, so I guess it's GitHub. But it's a whole, like a guide to how you can contribute. So there's like why and how can you do this thing if you want. Because of course it's voluntary. but as I also said in the start, I would like very much for people to hear this and go back to their managers and say, I want to work with open source. It's fully feasible. I've done it. It's working. I had to say it many times though, but in the end he got it. So for a company, I think it's very important that open source is a part of the strategy. And it means, I mean CEO level strategy, like when you have the old CXOs gathered in a meeting, they are talking about open source. It's a major importance because there's a liability for the company if the license compliance is not upheld. If you are using open source software and you don't know about it, you can use it wrong. You can use open source software that's licensed in a way that precludes you from using it the way you're using it. I won't go so much into detail because there's a lot of legal stuff there, but basically if you don't know that you're using open source, you have a liability, you have a risk there. You need to manage that risk somehow. But also there's a liability in some open source components being used that are old and maybe have security vulnerabilities that haven't been fixed, or they have been fixed in a newer version and you just don't know about it. That's the point of like companies like mine. We make software for our clients. The clients will claim, yeah, we own the software that you make for us. And I've challenged one client that said the same thing. I was talking to them about open source and he was like, why should we care about this? I said, yeah, so who owns the software we're making for you? Yeah, it's us. So who's responsible then? Yeah, it's us. Okay, I'm listening. So it was interesting. Well, companies also need to consolidate their efforts. Like we are so many thousand employees that if we everyone start doing this a little bit here and a little bit there, it's going to be a lot of double work. It's going to be, it's not going to be very efficient. It's going to be missing from some projects. It's going to be great in other projects, and we just don't know. So we should have like a consolidated way of doing things internally. So the industry as a whole have a lot of companies that are doing this have gotten together and they started calling this the Open Source Program Office, or the OSPO. And they have collected and gathered a lot of the best practices that they have come up with in I don't know, it's not a company, it's like an organization. It's called the To-Do Group. Means talk openly, develop openly. And they are advocating the use of the Open Source Program Office as a means to educate and to inform everyone across your company about open source and how it works and how it's made and how you can contribute and how you can create open source and all those things that I'm talking about. So it's like a central function inside your company that will help all the different parts of your company. If it's a big company or just whoever needs it. It's like calming the waters for open source usage and creation. And also you can use the Open Source Program Office to coordinate company-wide efforts, safe and compliant usage, contributing as a company. That's a whole other difference in there, because contributing as a company, then there's some legal stuff. You need some lawyers to look at this and blah, blah, blah. You can tell I'm not a lawyer, right? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but there are so many benefits for this because, well, people who work in open source, they learn a lot, and your employees will be more enthusiastic. They will be more engaged in their work. There will be a lot of happy faces around the company from people who are actually making a difference, making a contribution in the world. So. The todogroup.org is the place they gather. There was a meeting in that the European chapter of that thing today. I was busy with this presentation, so I couldn't take part of that. But there's a monthly thing that what they're doing. They started a European chapter because it was originally American, and as you know, there are time zone differences, and that's kind of hard to get European companies to do meetings at night and in the evening. So they started the European chapters for the European companies that are part of the To-Do group. we'll look briefly at what we are doing in Tietoevry. I would love to say that we are best in class in open source, but fortunately I've just been there for 2 years now, but we're getting somewhere. So I won't take credit for it, but I'm now a member of the Linux Foundation. As I said, we inherently support the more than 200 open source projects that are supported by Linux Foundation. And they support these projects in different ways, like whatever they need, basically. If they need money to run their servers and websites and stuff, then they can ask for money from the Linux Foundation. And the Linux Foundation is also like an umbrella organization over many others. So the Cloud Native Compute Foundation is one of them. And they are doing Kubernetes and lots of other projects around that. Linux, of course, is a part of Linux Foundation. They pay Linus Torvalds' salary, for instance, and a few others. So they support the development of Linux. Another thing we do is we have like weekly just meetings. We have an hour every Thursday. We call it the Open Source Friday on Thursdays, because Fridays are so overloaded already with meetings. So I had to move it to Thursday, but there was such a good name, so we kept it. And it's just, we get together for an hour and just rant about whatever we dislike. So it's basically just a very low-key thing to do every week, but trying to get some traction. And we are doing some internal education. We are encouraging employees to take the Linux Foundation. They have a whole lot of, I mentioned one of the courses, but there's a lot of courses on open source from the Linux Foundation. And there are other courses there that some are paid, some are free, but we encourage our employees to take these courses and learn more. So, and me and some others are working on an open source contributors guide, so we can start making real contributions and teaching our employees that yes, we are allowed to. First of all, we are allowed to contribute to open source, and we are encouraged to. So we can put down our hours and everything to make a real contribution. We are running source code scans of our client repos, so some are client projects, and we are analyzing these things and looking at what kind of software is there, are there any outdated versions, what licenses are in use, and we're trying to consolidate this into a report and talking to the clients about what this means for them, and trying to educate a little bit about how open source works. And that's where the conversation came up, where what do we care about open source? Yeah, because you own the software. So anyway, we are also trying to make C-level management, like the CXOs, do the right thing. That's really hard, by the way. It's really hard to get them to, why should we spend money on this? So I want to form an advisory board to help establish the open source project program office internally in our company. So we'll see how that goes. This is a board. It would be a board connecting with different representatives across the business, like HR, because we can use open source as a boon for recruitment. If we tell people that, well, come work for us and you can work with open source, then we think we can have access to a whole other talent pool that usually don't want to work for corporate entities. Legal advisors should be accounted for license compliance. Our contracts need to handle open source. We need to talk to our salespeople because they need to talk to our clients about open source. We need marketing. We have to brag about using open source, and we have to brag about making or contributing to open source. So we should talk to marketing about that. And of course, developers, engineers, project managers, they're all in it together, and they should be educated about fair and ethical use of and creation of open source. Yeah, just quickly, I ran out of time. I see that for a long time ago. Inner source, it's using the same practices as open source, but doing it internally. Like inside the company, everyone is under the same NDA, right? So it's no problem to open the software internally so that everyone can contribute to internal projects. That should be really easy to do. Applying the same practices internally, I said that. Lowers the barrier for everyone in the company to contribute. And you can contribute, you can discover software that's already been made by others in the company, and you can use it if you need it, or you can contribute to it if you like it, if they're working on the same technology as you, or so forth. So if everyone is doing their own little silo thing, then nobody knows what the others are doing, right? So it's kind of hard to know what to do. But everybody wins when everybody's collaborating. So, in closing, and I'm sorry I ran out of time, but I hope it's been fun and entertaining anyway. Most of all, I hope you have, I have sparked a little interest for you to take part in this dugnad, this open source. Please talk to your manager about open source. Refer to this talk. I understand it will be put online. Let's make a difference. Let's spread the word. And I hope that each one of you want to make at least one little contribution to any kind of open source software in the weeks. And if you do, or if you don't, please let me know and tell me how it went. If you choose not to, please tell me why. So yeah, anyway, that's basically it. And we can have a quick look at the Q&A up here. Okay, right there. Is this one? Yep. I think there's a couple of new ones, maybe? It was just rebuilt from the last time. Okay, good. That's a nice little word cloud. No questions from the audience. Does anyone have any questions?
How many projects do you contribute to?
Well, there are not a lot, actually. I'm just busy talking about it. I have made some contributions. I made a live contribution last Hacktoberfest in October. Made a small contribution to I made a Norwegian version of a word list for a name generator. I made some other small contributions as well, but it's time to start, and I should make more contributions. I would very much like to. So yeah, and yeah.
I couldn't help but notice the copyright icon on the bottom of all the slides.
Yes, of course, there's a copyright. Open source doesn't mean that you don't have copyright. If you make an original work, you automatically get copyright to it. But if you choose to open source it, you add a license that says you can use this. But even if you don't do anything, if you make original graphics, software, you write a book, whatever, you automatically have the copyright to it without doing anything else. So the open source license is to make it open. That's why. This presentation, as I said, it will be made available. I think actually there's a GitHub repo, but that's not open because I have some other things in there that are not open and not able to discuss them externally. But the presentation as it is, it will be made available. I'll find the link and I'll put it in the meetup, I guess, somewhere. And if there are no other questions, then I will say tack för mig. Thank you.